Okay, hey, thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Dustin. I'm founder of Civic Initiatives, and please look on my LinkedIn page if you don't know who I am already. So if you have questions during the presentation, there's two things. One is if you would like to join in and ask questions, we can read any comments that you have against the video. And so we'll try to track those and see if we can chime in questions. I think we've got 6 or 7 that we're going to go through. So even if you don't want to drop in, hopefully we hit your topic. If you're really interested in these topics and you want to talk afterwards, either about some of the speaking that I'm doing on these topics at procurement conferences or the potential to do some work for you in the topics that we talked about, please go to procurementagent.ai, which will take you to a page on the Civic website where you can say you'd like to talk. So with that as preamble out of the way, let me introduce Steve Meier, who's the head of innovation for Kung Fu.ai. Steve, why don't you introduce yourself and Kung Fu.ai? And obviously people want to know about the fun name. So maybe talk a little bit about the company as well.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dustin. It's exciting to be here, so it'll be fun. Like you said, my name's Steve Meier. I'm one of the co-founders of Kung Fu.ai. Non-traditional background. I'm a co-founder, but I'm a non-technical co-founder. Spent about a decade prior to starting Kung Fu.ai in the Fortune 500 tech sector, working for a boutique consulting firm, predominantly with IBM and IBM Watson groups. Got to cut my teeth in AI back in 2015 to 2017 period, helping IBM apply IBM Watson across a couple of interesting use cases. So fell in love with it, so much so that I took a risk and decided to start a consulting practice around artificial intelligence. And that's exactly what we do. We help our customers both on the strategy and engineering side. And the name is an interesting story in that most people confuse Kung Fu with a martial art. And while that's true, it's actually a very narrow use of the word, where Kung Fu actually is more often used, especially in Eastern cultures, as a verb and a way and a process of acquiring any great skill or knowledge over many years in hard work, in discipline, and practice, which in our estimation, we feel like is the road to artificial intelligence mastery. Is it's time and practice, and like a good Kung Fu master, we can teach it to you and fight for you today, but our hope is that you will acquire the skill yourself over a period of time. So we thought it was appropriate for the company name.
Very interesting. Great answer. So I found you through a common friend a couple months ago, and we started collaborating in run up to the speech that I did at NIGP Forum, which was called Generative AI, the new tool in the toolkit, where I was trying to take the topic and present it at layman plus. So coming down from you guys as deep implementers, but bringing it higher than just sometimes the relatively simplistic stuff that you can see on LinkedIn. So had a lot of good feedback off of that presentation. I've already updated it twice. I'll be doing that at other procurement conferences around the country, both this year and into next year. And there's a lot of excitement. I would say as much excitement on this topic as anything I've seen in several years of being involved in content, both for the application for people individually and then organizationally, the opportunity that AI can present. And so let's take it on the individual basis first, and then we'll talk about the organizational implications. So I think what has really astounded me as far as the difference in this piece of technology, as you mentioned, Watson and other things that have been there before, is just how unbelievably accessible it is. You gave me a graphic that I have in the presentation that talks about this evolution, and that right now we're able to provide unstructured data and get an unstructured response, which is new. And the barrier to entry is so low for an individual to simply go to one of those pages and to be able to type simple questions or incredibly complex prompts. So it's really unbelievable. So if anybody on here has not spent time in it, there's a lot that we could talk about images and video, but for this conversation, we're primarily talking about text. Go to chat.openai.com, play with it. There's other tools, but you'll be blown away if you haven't played with it yet. So Steve, describe what's happening to somebody who's interested but hasn't really dipped their toe in their water. How would you describe this to to your mom or your aunts or your long lost high school buddy who's like, what is all this and what's happening?
Yeah, it's really profound in the fact that this unstructured data in, unstructured data out, in that's what we do. We take in visual cues, audio data, the world around us, our five senses, and output something unstructured in return, an opinion, our voice, our thoughts. And that's in essence why this is becoming more accessible, in that we can actually interface in natural language with a artificial intelligent agent, and then in return get some sort of intelligent response back. And I think what has really put a spotlight on the field of artificial intelligence and the need for artificial intelligence is the fact that any one of us can go to this virtual agent and have what seemingly an intelligent conversation with it, ask questions and get a better response than we would ultimately get from a search query. And effectively what's happening is there was this aha moment back in 2017 that computers are better with numbers than they are words. And that's not really the aha moment, but translating the words back to numbers and effectively taking your natural language query and converting it into a point like you put on a graph. You think of your X and your Y axis, you put a point on a graph. Well, this graph just happens to have unlimited planes. And by doing that, you can start to put words as a point on a graph and start to see patterns. And now our words are mathematical input and sentences can be math equations. And all of a sudden the computer can predict what the correct answer is to your question. So all of a sudden your words and response become a prediction problem, and it keeps predicting what they think is the natural output. And it's getting very, very good at that. And it can even go so far as start calculating the distance of points to start to understand patterns in new ways. And what that means to us is that we can get really sophisticated analysis with very little effort and zero programming. And that's just door buster when it comes to this space. So it's very, very exciting. It's making AI really useful to everyone with a very low barrier to entry for the very first time.
Great answers again. I'm going to have to listen back and pepper in a little bit of that sophistication into my core speech. I like the way you talk about translating sentences into equations. I've said it similarly, but you said it better. So thanks definitely for that viewpoint. So let's stay in the individual impact before we go into the organizational impact. So I described three things in the speech that I think public procurement, since primarily our audience is public procurement, although public sector in general, I think these also apply, that it's excellent at synthesis, the ability to take extremely large data sets and to be able to search and remodel and remold it to produce everything from action items to synthesized groupings of information in a way that makes it so much easier to go through gigantic data sets. The best brainstormer of all time. It means that you never have to start with a blank piece of paper. You can always describe a scenario that you're trying to build a document or a piece of content against, a requirement set against from a specification perspective. And you get back information that is actionable in the sense that it's at a place where it can be edited. And myself personally, I'm a much better editor than I am sitting with a blank piece of paper and writing it out every time. And then the third was an on-demand quant, that the ability to do certain mathematical things, such as the simplest as Excel formulas on hand for the rest of time, being able to do math within the tool, being able to do things like coding and actual programming and SQL data sets. So those were the three areas that I thought had the most impact for individuals who are trying to find, where's the edge of this rock that they can pick up from an individual tool perspective. So talk about any of those three, or things that you would add, or how you would kind of say, what is at an individual level, what does it provide as a tool set today?
No, I think those are really good. And where else I may highlight is analyst. So what effectively is these large language models, these GPTs, these LMs, they are a magical analyst that can do the work of an army of analysts in many respects. So the ability to take a sophisticated question, should I buy from this company? Should I invest in this company? There is quite a bit of research that is involved in understanding the company's viability, the price of the product. Is it a fair price? If will they deliver if we purchase? Are they a company that's growing and is sound? That could be 8 hours worth of research. You can effectively whittle that down into 8 minutes of carefully curated prompts or questions to a language model. And that's magical, right? It might take an army of analysts to take that level of question and get you a response back in 8 to 10 minutes. So I think analyst is really important, researcher, and another one I'd add is monitor. So if you want to understand if certain phenomenon are present in a large volume of data that's constantly being ingested into your business, think of documents where anomalies or fraud may occur. These models are very good at looking for patterns of phenomenon and being able to detect them, where you might have an army of researchers who are constantly looking for changes in regulation or potential fraud issues. So I think those are also capabilities that we should be tracking.
Excellent. So moving organizationally, so when organizations are trying to take on a new piece of technology, they're always, of course, going to rightfully try to make sure that they have it set up to be able to be successful at it, and that they're not walking into something that they can't manage. And so there's things that we can talk about, things like there's an ability for the data to be wrong because it's making estimations. So those are called hallucinations, which I find you can tend to see those relatively quickly, but that's been a concern set. But probably the number one concern I've heard is just the concept of what happens with the data when I create a query. So, if I make a query that says, I want to take notes from an evaluation committee and to be able to drop them in order to pluck out action items, is it possible to query the query? Can somebody come in and say, have there been any evaluation meetings from X or Y or Z? And I think that concern is one of the main ones that I think people have to kind of get their heads around. I personally feel like, from what I've understood, that the query is not retained in that specific way, in the sense that it is presenting a question that produces the mathematical formula, as you said, and then it produces a mathematical formula back. I think we all come from paradigms where we're concerned about a large data set sitting out there that is exposable. So let's talk about it in two ways. One is just simply going to the open tools that are out there now. What is a good data hygiene process on being able to use the tool and not feel like you're creating giant stores of information? After you answer that, then let's talk about how we can establish a more limited access environment that maybe amps up the kind of concerns or questions that people may have on that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, at the 10,000 foot level, we get pulled into a lot of LLM advisories. Hey, help us understand this model versus that API. It's truly a build versus API conversation. And the answer is yes. Likely you need both. And these APIs that are available to us today are, I think, are getting often a bad rap. It's unfair to call them insecure when it comes to certain types of topics. I think the more sensitive the topic and the higher risk the scenario, that maybe we would like to leverage a large language model, more oversight is certainly required. But there's going to be situations where you can leverage these APIs in many situations, and there's going to be scenarios where you're going to want to use open source or something more private. But I will say that specifically some of the big guys in this space that are providing great APIs are adding additional guardrails to make things more private and secure, if that is a big concern. But to your point, Dustin, it is basically scattershotting your input into a bunch of mathematical equations and units, and then constructing the best response based on a prediction problem. So in terms of it, keeping a memory or a log of what exactly you give it isn't quite fair, but there are certainly concerns and reasons why sometimes you may want to be private.
Before we go to private, let me just sort of pivot the scenario just a little bit, and hopefully you can tell me if my scenario statement is correct. I think that government is used to potentially a scenario that says, here's a Word document that includes something that might be lightly sensitive, and I'm going to send it to an individual to do a transcription. So I send the document is received by an individual, the individual does a transcription, and then they send me back the transcription. So in that scenario, in use case 1, there was a full document, it went somewhere, and it has a possibility to be retained as the document, which is the 4 words or the 4 corners of the document with the words in the middle. So that would generate that concern of the document is existing in the universe. As a layman, in my understanding, when we're doing a query into an AI scenario, it's almost I think I joked with you, it's atomizing Captain Kirk and reappearing him on the face of the planet. Is it the same Captain Kirk, or did we kill Captain Kirk and rebuild him on the island, on the planet? Because the document, when it hits the query, it's being atomized into a math equation, and then a math equation is coming back. And that's what I've been trying to explain to people, that if we're thinking we're in the situation where we've sent a full document to somebody for a transcription event, and we're trying to make that be an exact equivalent to what happens when we do a query on AI, it's not an equivalent. So that's my contention. So tell me if that is in your zone of agreement, or where we need to nuance that.
I think what I would add to that, it's definitely a yes, and what I would add to that is when you are training models is when the model is learning off information. Oftentimes when you are interfacing with an API, you're using inference or prediction, but you're not training the model. So basically you are showing it information and saying, hey, give me a response based on what you see. We're not actually putting the information back into the API or the model. Now, there are certain situations where in the terms of use, you are in fact training the model. But in most instances, the model is pre-trained. It has already learned all that it can learn for the time being until the next release comes out. And you're basically showing it information and it's making a prediction, and that prediction is a response, which is kind of funny to think of a dialogue with a virtual agent as a prediction problem. But in actuality, everything we do is a prediction problem. Dustin, I hear your question. I predict what you and the audience may want to hear, and then I give a response. And sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm not so right, but everything can be framed fundamentally into a prediction problem. And that's effectively what we're doing here, more so when we're using APIs.
Well, in the speech that I give, the simplest level I can do to talk about how this watch works before we talk about what time it is, I bring up a clip from one of the websites that says, if we were to create a prediction formula that says if the words once upon a were in a row, we know that the next word is probably not armadillo, and it's probably time. But then the ability to build those prediction models are based across a huge level of deep multi-planal learning, as you referenced. And so to the degree that we're teaching the model something about our specific query, it's teaching it how to refine the future responses, but it's not necessarily teaching it that here's the notes from the evaluation committee. It's teaching it how to further refine a mathematical model.
Let me give you an analogy. Think about yourself when you were somewhere between 15 and 18 years old and you were learning to drive a car. And you are taking the wheel for the first time, maybe even getting on the interstate or the highway for the first time. Your palms are sweaty. You're alert to absolutely everything. Perhaps you're maybe too alert to your surroundings around you. And it's a very tense moment, but you're absolutely learning as you're driving that vehicle. And all that processing is creating a lot of the anxiety likely. Mm-hmm. Now, fast forward 20, 30 years and think about driving today. Mm-hmm. You're not necessarily learning anything, but you're doing fundamentally the same action. You're identifying, you're predicting, you're reacting. But all of that learning has kind of hit its threshold. You're no longer training, you're doing. I think in some respects, you can think of some of these more prefab models as a similar experience. They've gone through the training mechanisms of learning to drive the car. Now they're just executing. So
No, that's
hopefully that resonates, but it felt good when I was thinking about it.
No, I like it. That's great. That's absolutely great. So, excuse me there. And I'll also note that, again, that if anybody has any questions that they'd like to have us pick up, feel free to pick up. If you're listening and you're interested in picking up the topic, just go to procurementagent.ai and we'll be happy to follow up with you. So now let's talk about like how to maybe, if somebody is going to make an enterprise investment, or they want to really say, I want to do this, but I want to do it in an area where I have some controls on the outside edge of the fence line, and I want to be able to have this be more secure. So what kind of options are there for somebody who, they say it may be all well and good for an individual to use this over here, but I want to deploy something that I'm confident in. What does that even mean from a deployment perspective? And what are how does somebody raise that up a level through something that would be in their own control space?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you definitely have the ability to weigh out those trade-offs, build versus API, right? And likely you will have API use cases that make a ton of sense because you want the capability, the cost makes sense for you, the reduction to get to production is there, which is always very, very important and useful, especially when you're trying to solve a hard problem as quickly and cost effectively as possible. But then there's going to be a lot of instances too where you've decided that you want to use an open source model. You want to host that model inside your environment, and you want to train that model to perform a very specific task at a very, very high level, in which case you will invest more to get that model trained. However, the trade-off is you may get additional capability than what might otherwise be available and a private and secure environment. So the open source community is constantly evolving, and the state of the art is moving very, very quickly. So you can use a model that may be effective today and then use another one that may be more effective into the future. But those are some of the trade-offs, right? If you want fast and ready, API is going to be the way to go. And there's going to be use cases where it's low risk and privacy is less of a concern. And then if you want powerful and private, there's going to be more cost associated and effort associated with getting there. But likely the answer is, well, we kind of need both or something in between.
Well, let's stay kind of within that, and organizationally, I know that that your organization has had an opportunity to work with some of the federal government partners on maybe different kinds of projects within the DoD zone or some higher ed institutions and laboratories and so forth. So whatever you're able to talk about, and you can feel free to extrapolate it. You don't have to name individual projects, but maybe share a bit of perspective on the kind of use cases that you've been seeing from governmental clients and where you think some of the opportunity lies for government in this space.
Yeah, there's a lot of fascinating work out there. We had the opportunity to work with a major university here in the area and work with their career services and help them with labor prediction. So the thinking was that their career services, think of, again, we can create this magical analyst, right? These career services folks are spending tons of time looking at labor statistics and forecasts, trying to understand what companies and sectors are more likely to grow so they can invest their time in making the right partnerships so they can get their students better career service advice. Hey, let's steer your curriculum in this direction, get better internships, and ultimately at the end of the day, better employment, which is a lot of what these universities are graded on. So being able to use data and machine learning and put a whole bunch of really interesting data sources together and make a prediction that is more effective than what our human brains can do to understand, no, you need to think about this sector and these companies. And oh, by the way, there's a shift going on where certain skill sets that existed yesterday that were in high demand are actually moving in another direction entirely. So that becomes a really interesting one. Another example, especially in the government space, we see a bunch of document data problems, meaning we have a lot of documents and a lot of data inside those documents, and the ability to interrogate that data, understand patterns of that data, maybe even automate processes that are very paper driven become the concern, and getting that information out is very, very difficult. So especially using large language models, this becomes a lot easier than how it was when we started working on these problems 6 years ago, where we can actually drop documents in with very little training and get insights out with simple questioning, which becomes very, very powerful, both when you're trying to understand, is a phenomenon present in a document? What are the trend lines in this document? Or perhaps if something happens, we need to move it to this part of the process versus that part of the process. So it's really an intelligent triage type of use case. And there's plenty of case management issues out there where this becomes really, really ripe. Or if we just want help with research or analysis, another great example of where these things can play. We are seeing a tremendous amount of appetite and demand for strategy work. We need a position. We need to know the use cases, and we certainly need a lot of governance. And we have to understand when these models are performing or not performing, which means we need test and evaluation criteria. This is becoming more important for all organizations, especially as we move into generative, because it's inevitable. We're all going to have it and use it sooner rather than later. But to do this in the best possible way, to get the most performance with the least amount of risk, we need to have a plan in place. And doing that work, whether you do that work and inform us and people like us go execute, or we inform you and figure out if we or you can go execute, it becomes critical to doing this well.
And in my speech, there's some areas that we're very interested in as people who work with public procurement shops around the country. One is we've been deploying in pilot form generative AI chatbots that are trained within a body of knowledge against some of the procurement manual works that we do, which is an interesting alternative way to be able to do searches and generate different kinds of information so that it's more accessible both to people who might be answering questions of end users, as well as being able to provide self-service to end users. Chatbots have been around a long time, of course, but they tended to be very rigid and very quickly got you to the wrong answer in a way that we've really been finding some success on. We're also interested in playbooks around aspects of handling requisition management, some of the solicitation activities, some of the spend activities. That's something that we'll be continuing to try to build around. So I think there's any number of possible use cases for this kind of tool set. And in the speech, I also talk about how one of my closest mentors and friends on overall technology had said he didn't think we would have access to some of this kind of stuff in our lifetimes, which I thought was pretty remarkable. So lots of really, really interesting options and opportunities here.
Dustin, I might add two others to that, because that triggered a memory. We've done some work specifically on the commercial side of procurement. Great use cases, spend analysis and spend optimization, and being able to look at all of our suppliers and understand perhaps when have we double paid, or when are we paying two suppliers for the same thing and we have a surplus. Where is the anomalous spending? Oh, we don't typically spend that much in this category. That's a bit odd. These are all things we can catch. It just takes a lot of work to do it. And we can really reduce that workload and even automate some of those capabilities. And the other part too is the optimization. So the next level of intelligence is, great, where are we overspending? Then you ask a better question, how might we spend more effectively? And being able to optimize spend and becomes really important. Now, the one thing I want to point out there is that language models aren't the silver bullet. There's really no silver bullet in AI, but they do provide a baseline capability, which you can put other AIs on top of. So the first question we ask is, where is the anomalous spend happening? The next question we might ask is, optimize my general spending habit. And one AI is built on top of the other to do both levels of sophistication. They're using functionally very different artificial intelligence algorithms. But when you start to sequence these things together, we can get more and more sophisticated use cases and capabilities.
Well, and we'll sit in that for a minute. Because I think what's really important about some of these tools is the AI is there, in my opinion, as a helper for human beings to be able to do some of the more strategic pieces of work. And specifically in the case of spend analysis, which we've done a lot of, If you have shops that have always been relatively transactional, then frankly, sometimes there isn't necessarily even a need for spend analysis because it doesn't affect the order in which you do things, or potentially doesn't specifically affect the go-to-market strategy. And so a lot of times if you're going into a procurement shop that hasn't had the opportunity to do spend analysis before, what we're trying to do is to democratize the access to data. We want it so that it's not that only one person knows how to get the data out of the ERP and he's not even a procurement person, so it didn't matter anyways. We're trying to say, we can teach a persona or an agent, in that case, a virtual agent, to be able to say, what are the kind of trends that we're looking for that would affect our go-to-market strategy or our negotiating approach? And then being able to feed it with information, and it doesn't necessarily have to go all the way to the end. Like you mentioned, having a second AI that could say, well, how do I optimize against that? There could be a point where even just simply saying we're trying to democratize the access to data so that we're teaching our buyers how the information that we have in our systems affect our choices. And then we don't have to teach them how to do all of the smallest, microest pivot table infinity, but we can say, here's an ability to have a tool that can provide an answer to this question. And here's what you as the human being do with that information in order to be good at procurement. That would dramatically expand the role and the nature of spend analysis in procurement in a way that would be very fundamentally impactful on a lot of procurement shops.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so then that way, that's a great example. I mean, do you get asked that kind of question? Like, where does one of the slides from my deck was, somebody from the World Economic Forum saying AI isn't going to take your job, but somebody who knows how to use AI might, right? It's like, how do you answer the question about, the role of AI in relation to humans and the kind of work displacement that AI may have versus making the work that humans do more creative, because it does some of the really deep, grungy stuff that we don't really like spending time on anyways. How do you generally answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, we've spent many decades trying to recreate human level capability in different respects. I will tell you the state of the art today is a very low level of human capability. An analyst may be even ambitious depending on your use case. You might rather consider them an intern. You have this army of magical interns, and you give all the tasks that you give an intern, you can now potentially give to some of these large language models. However, think about the intern scenario. Interns need management, they need governance, and the interns can learn, and maybe the interns graduate and become a low-level analyst, and you can trust them in that respect, but there's always going to need to be this management layer. At the end of the day, the intern helps extend our capability, right? They don't exist in a silo usually. It's never usually project-based. It could be, but typically they augment our ability to get to the things that we need to get to because we don't want to do certain things that really are a time suck. So think of the language model or the AI in a very similar fashion. It's an intern. It needs all the care and attention and oversight of an intern. It's going to take a lot of the grunt work off my plate, thankfully, and maybe over time I can coach it up and it can do a little bit more and a little bit more, but you're always going to have a similar relationship, and that's really what bleeding edge means today.
I have two more questions. There was also a question in chat. Excuse me, I got a frog in my throat today. So I have two more questions, and there was also a question in chat. I'm going to pick that one up from somebody who says, this is new and exciting, but it's 100% new. What should how can I even basically have any impact on that, or how can I make use of it? And that's, David, my speech is actually kind of primarily targeted at that. If you go to my LinkedIn page, you'll see I have a little carousel on there on 3 things that AI can do with some examples and use cases of how you would use it. But literally, you can go to chat.openai.com. There's obviously other competitors to ChatGPT, but it was the first. And either type very simple prompts about your profession, like tell me about this thing in procurement, or tell me about this thing for my hobby. And then you can also form extremely complex prompts, basically describing a scenario, as Steve just said, as if you're giving a project to an intern. And you'll be astounded by the kind of results and the outputs that it can produce because it's been trained against these extremely large language models. Steve, what if somebody who's 100% not had any touch in this, is interested in playing with it, what's the best way just to even get educated on this that you advise people when they ask you about it?
Yeah, I think and this is constantly developing under our feet right now, because this kind of breakthrough moment of ChatGPT only happened this past November. We're not even a year old, and think about how much we've seen. So obviously get hands-on with some of the free and open tools at your disposal. The Bards, the ChatGPTs, the Claudes, there's a handful of them, and just play around with it to start to exercise the limits and the capabilities. And there's a lot of education out there in terms of what is a prompt? How might I prompt more effectively? Meaning, how do I ask these LMs questions, and how might I ask them different questions? And if I don't get the response I was hoping for, how might I rephrase the question in such a way to get the response I was hoping for? There's a lot of education out there that even you could ask a large language model, where might I find access to this type of education? You might be surprised and delighted what you find in that respect. If you're just getting started and you feel like you need to take some sort of action, it's very important to have a game plan and put together a playbook on how might you actually leverage this across your organization. Think about your strategy. Think about, take just a scratch pad and write AI magical intern on the top of it, and put one column hopes and one column restraints. And your hopes are all the things you wish you could give this AI magical intern. And the restraints are, here are the things I would never allow this AI magical intern to do. And that's really nascent strategy. And then start building on that and getting your education, and you'll see how this starts to fuel itself. But to the extent you can, bring in help for people that understand the space, whether you hire that help or you partner with that help.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about that here in the next question. Before we go to the next question, I'll say my dad, who's a doctor, when I first showed it to him, I said, come up with the most complicated thing that a computer would not know about medicine. And he gave me some extremely complicated scenario, and I typed it in, and I could see in his eyes when the answer came up that he was astounded. I took it to one of my sons and said, let's describe a non-player character for a computer game, and give it some characteristics and just make them up out of the dead blue sky. And let's ask it to create a non-player character sheet. And the eyes that open when people see what can come out of this. So take any scenario that you're personally interested and try to stump the computer by asking it to produce a thing that you think is unlikely to get, and you will really be taken up with what you can do. So let's come back to where you were going, Steve, where you were talking about getting help. So I did introduce in that speech that together, Civic and Kung Fu are going to be looking to go and work on some common clients through a variety of things if they're in an exploration mode. Art of the Possible workshops, where we're able to help explore, do some hands-on answer topics, to be able to produce certain deliverables that are able to be helpful. Working on policy development. I know that's a key issue for everyone from the procurement shop to the technology shop to the finance shop. Being able to have effective policies that are the correct shaping policy, but not just saying don't go do anything. Horizon assessments, where you can say we want to build some of our own platform sets, implement certain playbooks. So all of these things, I think, are concepts for organizations. All of these things are concepts for organizations where they are trying to say, I want to establish guardrails, but just like we set up guardrails on the freeway because we intend to go fast, use the guardrail phrase before, guardrails that are intended to protect, but also support going fast. So I know some people are seeking to move past the trepidation about what is not known in order to move into the excitement of what can be. In my LinkedIn feed yesterday, Sean Naylor, who's the former CIO for Vermont, had a quote that's been on my feed twice that says, it's not about stopping it, it's about managing it. So we're looking forward to working with you on some of these projects and helping government and higher education be comfortable with deployment strategies that can let them feel comfortable getting on the front edge of the curve. So, thoughts about how you've done some of that kind of work to help people get comfortable with getting out on the curve, and the kind of things that we can do together, leveraging civics, public sector, state and local background and Kung Fu's AI background. Like, what are some things we can do for people with this?
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier, it's good to have a game plan. It's good to develop a playbook. In reality, what I'm referring to is assess your opportunities and identify your risks in leveraging this technology and start to understand what might be available to you today in terms of opportunity versus opportunities you'd love to have, and think about them 2-3 years time or 18 months time, if that's a more appropriate horizon. But where can all the things go wrong? What do we not know that we must know before we get to deployment? How do we even build our first environment or model? How might we start a sandbox so at least we can, in a safe place, have our people inside our organization be able to bang and test down these models in a way that we're very comfortable with, that's private and secure. So these are all the things that we guide people towards and help them really lay that out and package it up like a game plan or a playbook with some very precise recommendations on where do we get started right now, and opportunistically, where might we go and grow with additional technology and expertise investment. So truly crawl, walk, run when it comes to these types of technologies. Definitely look before you leap, but that's effectively what we're helping folks do.
Excellent. Well, I'll close as I started by saying, if you're interested in this topic and you want to have a conversation about it, go to procurementagent.ai. That'll take you to a direct page on the Civic site, and we're happy to talk to you about it. Steve, I've gotten a lot of great comments even while we're sitting here, a couple of texts, and people are really interested in the topic. And it's great to have a true expert on who really is sitting in this all day long and being able to really work in it deeply. And as you said, for all intents and purposes, for the rest of us, this fell out of a spaceship in November. So it's all new and people are very excited about it. So we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge today and look forward to working with you on this in the future.
It was my pleasure. Thanks, Dustin.
Great. Thanks, everybody. This will be available on demand right after I click to end the stream. And we will also put this into our podcast. So thank you guys for listening and participating.